5 fiddles lay in a perfect circle on moss-covered ground, their strings still rosined, their bows arranged like compass points toward a center that held nothing but trampled earth and the smell of wet ash. A trapper named Silas Caldwell found them on November 3rd, 1894, 3 miles up Slaughter Creek in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Kentucky. The instruments showed no weather damage despite 6 weeks of mountain rain. No blood marked the wood. No struggle disturbed the clearing. But when Caldwell lifted the nearest fiddle to examine the maker's mark, he heard something that made him drop it and run. A single sustained note, though no hand touched the strings, that rose and fell like breathing. The music had been heard every night since September, drifting through the hollows where the Fletcher's Run string band had gone to play for isolated families who paid in cornmeal and cured meat. 7 musicians had walked into those hills. Not one walked out. The Fletcher's Run string band played their final confirmed performance on September 14, 1894, in the schoolhouse at Fletcher's Run, Kentucky, a crossroads settlement of perhaps 40 souls, scattered across steep hollows where the Cumberland Plateau began its climb toward Virginia. The schoolhouse was a single room of chinked logs with a pot-bellied stove and benches salvaged from a burned church. On clear nights, you could see 3 states from the ridge above town, but on that September evening, fog rolled up from the bottomlands thick enough to muffle sound and make lantern light look like hanging moons. Ephraim Frost led the band. He was 32, tall and wire-thin, with hands so large they made his fiddle look like a child's toy. He had learned to play from his grandfather, who had learned from circuit riders who brought ballads over from Scotland and Ireland in the 1780s. Ephraim could play 200 songs from memory and knew harmonies that made grown men weep about mothers they had buried decades before. Beside him stood his younger brother Nathaniel, 28, who played banjo with a driving rhythm that kept dancers moving through exhaustion. The Frost brothers had been performing together since Nathaniel was old enough to hold an instrument. They finished each other's phrases, traded melodies mid-song, and communicated through glances that looked like telepathy to audiences who did not share their blood. The other 5 members represented the band's evolution from family act to professional ensemble. Margaret Whitley was 24, a singer from Hazard who had joined them 2 years earlier after her husband died in a mine collapse. Her voice carried a plaintive quality that made every song sound like farewell. She wore her dark hair pinned in a bun that never seemed to loosen no matter how long they played. Thomas Kincaid, 41, played guitar and sang harmony. He had worked as a school teacher before discovering he could earn more playing music than educating children whose families could barely afford to feed them. He brought literacy to the group. He kept their bookings in a ledger and wrote letters to secure performances in towns they had never visited. James Farrell, 19, was their youngest member, a mandolin player from Fletcher County whose speed and technical precision elevated simple folk tunes into something approaching art. He practiced constantly, even while walking between towns, his fingers moving over imaginary frets. Sarah Newcomb, 37, played guitar and sang alto harmonies that wove through Margaret's soprano like smoke through branches. She was a widow who had lost 3 children to scarlet fever in a single week. Music was the only thing that kept her from walking into the river, she told people who asked why she traveled instead of settling. The 7th member was Jacob Riley, 52, who played bass and served as the band's advance scout, traveling ahead to arrange lodging and performance venues in towns that rarely saw outsiders. He was a former surveyor who knew the mountain trails better than most men knew their own property. He carried maps hand-drawn on scraps of paper, marking water sources and cabins where travelers could expect hospitality or find only suspicion. That September evening, they played for nearly 3 hours. 60 people crowded into the schoolhouse, more standing outside in the fog, listening through open windows. The band performed ballads and reels, hymns and work songs, the repertoire that sustained them through Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, places where people still sang in shape-note harmony and where music was the only entertainment that did not require money or travel. After the performance, Thomas Kincaid met with Reverend Amos Fletcher, the Baptist preacher for whom the settlement had been named. Fletcher was in his 70s, a gaunt man with a white beard that reached his chest and eyes that watered constantly from some untreated ailment. He sat at the schoolhouse desk while Kincaid counted their earnings: $4 in coin, a sack of dried apples, 3 pounds of salt pork, and a promissory note for 2 chickens to be collected when they returned through town. "You mentioned families further up the hollows," Kincaid said, making entries in his ledger. "Families who wanted music but could not travel down." Fletcher nodded slowly. "Up Slaughter Creek and beyond. 7, maybe 8 households. Some have not come to town in a year or more. The roads are poor. The distances discourage. We have walked poor roads before." "Not these roads," Fletcher said, his watery eyes fixed on Kincaid with sudden intensity. "These families live beyond where most folks go, beyond where most folks ought to go." Kincaid waited, pen suspended above his ledger. "They follow old ways," Fletcher continued, "practices that make the church-going folk uncomfortable. But their money is good, and they treat visitors fairly if you respect their customs." "What customs?" Fletcher stood, his joints cracking audibly in the quiet room. "Do not ask about their kin. Do not comment on what you see in their homes. Play only what they request. Take payment in whatever form they offer, and leave before full dark." He paused at the door. "Jacob Riley knows the trails. He has been up there before. Let him guide you, and you will be safe enough." The Reverend disappeared into the fog, leaving Kincaid with more questions than answers. They departed Fletcher's run at dawn on September 15th, the 7 of them walking single file up a trail that Jacob Riley assured them would take them to the first cabin by afternoon. Each carried an instrument case and a bedroll. Margaret Whitley and Sarah Newcomb shared the burden of a canvas sack containing food purchased from the general store: cornmeal, beans, and hard biscuits that would not spoil on the trail. The path followed Slaughter Creek, a fast-moving stream that descended from the high country in a series of small cascades. The water ran clear and cold, stained slightly brown from tannins leached from oak leaves. They refilled their canteens at mid-morning, splashing their faces in water so cold it made their teeth ache. "How did it get that name?" young James Farrell asked, gesturing at the creek. "Cherokee killed a party of surveyors here in 1798, Jacob Riley replied without turning around. "Or so the story goes. Every creek in these mountains has a name like that. Slaughter, massacre, bone, blood. The land remembers what men do upon it." The trail narrowed as they climbed. The creek fell away to their left, and the forest closed in on both sides. Oak, hickory, and chestnut trees, so tall their canopy blocked most of the morning sun. Rhododendron thickets crowded the understory, their glossy leaves creating green tunnels that smelled of damp earth and decay. By noon, they had climbed perhaps 800 feet. The temperature dropped noticeably. Ephraim Frost called a rest, and they sat on a fallen log to eat biscuits and dried apple slices. "How much further?" Nathaniel asked Riley. 2 hours to the Gaines cabin. We will play there tonight if they want music. Tomorrow we move higher. There are 3 more cabins within walking distance of each other. We can spend 2 days in that area, then move to the furthest families. And back to Fletcher's run by when. Thomas Kincaid was always calculating schedules, trying to honor commitments in other towns. A week if the weather holds, 10 days if it rains. Riley studied the sky through gaps in the canopy. Rain will make the trails dangerous. These slopes are mostly clay. They turn to grease when wet. They reached the Gaines cabin at 3 in the afternoon, a low structure of squared logs with a stone chimney and a shake roof weighted down with river rocks to keep mountain winds from peeling it away. A woman appeared in the doorway before they could knock. Tall, thin, perhaps 50, wearing a dress of homespun cloth dyed the dark brown of walnut hulls. Her gray hair hung loose past her shoulders. She studied them with pale eyes that did not blink as much as normal eyes should. "You are the music," she said, not a question. "We are," Ephraim confirmed. "Jacob Riley arranged for us to play for your family and your neighbors." "Riley," she said his name like she was tasting it. "He was here in spring. He said you would come. You are late." "We apologize. Other engagements. Come inside before you are seen from the ridge." She stepped back into the cabin's dimness. They exchanged glances but followed. The interior was larger than expected, extending back into the hillside in a way that suggested the structure was partially dug into the slope. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else. Something medicinal and unfamiliar, like herbs burning for purposes other than cooking. 3 children sat on the floor near the fireplace, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 10. They watched the musicians with the same unsettling stillness as their mother. "My husband is at the far field," the woman said. "He will return at dusk. You will play then. You will sleep in the loft. You will not leave until morning." It was not an invitation, but a set of instructions, delivered in a tone that made arguing feel dangerous. Thomas Kincaid opened his ledger. "What is your family's name, ma'am?" A pause, so long it became uncomfortable. Finally, "Gaines, Mercy Gaines." "And the names of your children?" "We do not speak names here," she said flatly. "Names have power. Names can be used. You are guests. Guests do not ask such questions." Kincaid closed his ledger. Silas Gaines returned at dusk, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 60 with a full black beard shot through with gray. He carried a rifle, a flintlock that looked older than Fletcher's run, and moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent his life walking steep terrain. He nodded to the musicians, but did not speak until after he had leaned the rifle in the corner and washed his hands in a basin by the door. "You play the old songs?" His voice was deep, almost a growl. "We know many songs," Ephraim said carefully. "Old and new. I want old. I want the ballads from across the water. I want songs my grandmother sang before the Revolution." Gaines settled into a rough chair by the fireplace. "I will know if you play them false." They played for 3 hours that night, standing in a semicircle near the fire, while the Gaines family sat and listened with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. The children never moved, never spoke, never seemed to blink. Mercy Gaines watched the musicians' hands more than their faces, as if looking for something in the way fingers moved across strings. Ephraim led them through ballads he had learned from his grandfather. Barbara Allen, The Demon Lover. The Twy, Sisters, Lord Randall. Songs about betrayal, murder, supernatural revenge, death by poison or drowning or heartbreak. Songs that had crossed the Atlantic generations ago and survived in these mountains long after they had been forgotten in the cities. Margaret Whitley's voice carried the mournful melodies with a purity that made the cabin walls seem to recede. Sarah Newcomb wove alto harmonies that turned simple tunes into something layered and strange. The instruments, fiddles, banjo, guitars, mandolin, bass, created a sound that was neither quite ancient nor quite modern, but existed in some space between. When they finished The Twa Sisters, a song about a girl drowned by her jealous sister, Silas Gaines leaned forward, his face ruddy in the firelight. "Again," he said. "Play that one again." They did, and when they finished, he nodded with evident satisfaction. "You know the true versions, not the cleaned-up church versions, not the schoolhouse versions, the versions with teeth." He stood and walked to a wooden box near the fireplace. From it, he withdrew a cloth bundle. "This is your payment for tonight." Inside the cloth were 3 silver coins. Not U.S. minting, but older, Spanish perhaps, worn smooth from handling. Beside them was a small leather pouch that gave off a smell like dried mushrooms and something sharper, more chemical. Thomas Kincaid reached for the coins, but hesitated at the pouch. "For protection," Mercy Gaines said from her seat near the door. "You will need it in the higher places." "Protection from what?" Neither Gaines answered. Silas simply rewrapped the bundle and handed it to Kincaid. "Sleep in the loft. Do not come down until morning light reaches the windows. Do not respond if you hear voices in the night. Do not look outside no matter what you hear." They climbed the ladder to the loft, a low space under the rafters barely tall enough to sit upright. They spread their bedrolls on the rough planks and lay down, still fully dressed, their instruments beside them. "What in God's name was that about?" young James whispered. "Nothing good," Jacob Riley replied. "Sleep if you can. We leave at first light." But sleep was difficult. The cabin creaked and settled in ways that sounded almost like footsteps. Twice Margaret Whitley thought she heard singing, a woman's voice, high and wordless, coming from somewhere outside. Once, near midnight, something heavy scraped across the cabin's roof, moving from one end to the other, then back again. In the darkness, Nathaniel Frost gripped his brother's arm. "Ephraim." "Do not respond," Ephraim whispered. "Do not look. They told us." Morning came slowly. When the first gray light touched the loft window, they packed quickly and climbed down to find the main room empty. The fire had burned to cold ash. A wooden plate near the door held biscuits and dried venison. A note written in a shaky hand read, "Second cabin 4 miles north. Follow the marked trees." They ate standing, anxious to leave. As they filed out, Ephraim glanced back once and saw Mercy Gaines watching from a shadowed corner, her pale eyes catching the dim light like an animal's. The door closed behind them. The mountains waited above. "We apologize. Other engagements. Come inside before you are seen from the ridge." She stepped back into the cabin's dimness. They exchanged glances but followed. The interior was larger than expected, extending back into the hillside in a way that suggested the structure was partially dug into the slope. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something medicinal and unfamiliar, like herbs burning for purposes other than cooking. 3 children sat on the floor near the fireplace, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 10. They watched the musicians with the same unsettling stillness as their mother. "My husband is at the far field," the woman said. "He will return at dusk. You will play then. You will sleep in the loft. You will not leave until morning." It was not an invitation, but a set of instructions, delivered in a tone that made arguing feel dangerous. Thomas Kincaid opened his ledger. "What is your family's name, ma'am?" A pause, so long it became uncomfortable. Finally, "Gaines," Mercy Gaines. And the names of your children? We do not speak names here, she said flatly. Names have power. Names can be used. You are guests. Guests do not ask such questions. Kincaid closed his ledger. Chapter 3. The First Night's Music. Silas Gaines returned at dusk, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 60 with a full black beard shot through with gray. He carried a rifle, a flintlock that looked older than Fletcher's run, and moved with the careful economy of someone who had spent his life walking steep terrain. He nodded to the musicians, but did not speak until after he had leaned the rifle in the corner and washed his hands in a basin by the door. You play the old songs? His voice was deep, almost a growl. We know many songs, Ephraim said carefully. Old and new. I want old. I want the ballads from across the water. I want songs my grandmother sang before the Revolution. Gaines settled into a rough chair by the fireplace. I will know if you play them false. They played for 3 hours that night, standing in a semicircle near the fire, while the Gaines family sat and listened with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. The children never moved, never spoke, never seemed to blink. Mercy Gaines watched the musicians' hands more than their faces, as if looking for something in the way fingers moved across strings. Ephraim led them through ballads he had learned from his grandfather. Barbara Allen, The Demon Lover, The Twa Sisters, Lord Randall, songs about betrayal, murder, supernatural revenge, death by poison or drowning or heartbreak. Songs that had crossed the Atlantic generations ago and survived in these mountains long after they had been forgotten in the cities. Margaret Whitley's voice carried the mournful melodies with a purity that made the cabin walls seem to recede. Sarah Newcomb wove alto harmonies that turned simple tunes into something layered and strange. The instruments, fiddles, banjo, guitars, mandolin, bass, created a sound that was neither quite ancient nor quite modern but existed in some space between. When they finished The Twa Sisters, a song about a girl drowned by her jealous sister, Silas Gaines leaned forward, his face ruddy in the firelight. Again, he said. Play that one again. They did, and when they finished, he nodded with evident satisfaction. You know the true versions, not the cleaned-up church versions, not the schoolhouse versions, the versions with teeth. He stood and walked to a wooden box near the fireplace. From it, he withdrew a cloth bundle. This is your payment for tonight. Inside the cloth were 3 silver coins, not U.S. minting, but older, Spanish perhaps, worn smooth from handling. Beside them was a small leather pouch that gave off a smell like dried mushrooms and something sharper, more chemical. Thomas Kincaid reached for the coins but hesitated at the pouch. For protection, Mercy Gaines said from her seat near the door. You will need it in the higher places. Protection from what? Neither Gaines answered. Silas simply rewrapped the bundle and handed it to Kincaid. Sleep in the loft. Do not come down until morning light reaches the windows. Do not respond if you hear voices in the night. Do not look outside no matter what you hear. They climbed the ladder to the loft, a low space under the rafters barely tall enough to sit upright. They spread their bedrolls on the rough planks and lay down, still fully dressed, their instruments beside them. What in God's name was that about? Young James whispered. Nothing good, Jacob Riley replied. Sleep if you can. We leave at first light. But sleep was difficult. The cabin creaked and settled in ways that sounded almost like footsteps. Twice Margaret Whitley thought she heard singing. A woman's voice, high and wordless, coming from somewhere outside. Once, near midnight, something heavy scraped across the cabin's roof, moving from one end to the other, then back again. In the darkness, Nathaniel Frost gripped his brother's arm. "Ephraim, do not respond," Ephraim whispered. "Do not look. They told us." Morning came slowly. When the first gray light touched the loft window, they packed quickly and climbed down to find the main room empty. The fire had burned to cold ash. A wooden plate near the door held biscuits and dried venison. A note written in a shaky hand read, "Second cabin 4 miles north. Follow the marked trees." They ate standing, anxious to leave. As they filed out, Ephraim glanced back once and saw Mercy Gaines watching from a shadowed corner, her pale eyes catching the dim light like an animal's. The door closed behind them. The mountains waited above. Act 2, on deepening and complicity. Chapter 4, The Marked Trail. The marked trees were hard to miss once you knew what to look for. Blazes cut deep into bark at eye level, filled with some dark substance that could have been pitch or dried blood or something else entirely. The cuts formed symbols, circles, crosses, triangles stacked in ways that made no sense to anyone except, presumably, the people who had carved them. Jacob Riley led them higher. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside in tight zigzags that forced them to pause frequently to catch their breath. The air thinned. The forest changed character. Fewer oaks, more pine and spruce, their needles carpeting the ground in layers that muffled footsteps. "Riley," Thomas Kincaid called ahead. "You have been here before. Tell us true. What are these people?" Riley stopped and turned. His face was drawn, older looking than it had been 2 days ago in Fletcher's run. "I do not know what they are. I know what they do. They keep to themselves. They follow customs that predate the churches. They believe the mountains are alive in ways that most folks have forgotten. And they pay well for music, which is all that should concern us." "That woman last night," Margaret Whitley said. "She looked at us like she was counting something, like she was measuring. Then let us hope we measured favorably." Riley turned and resumed walking. They reached the second cabin near noon. It sat in a small meadow carved from the forest, surrounded by a split-rail fence that enclosed a vegetable garden already going to seed in the September cold. Smoke rose from the chimney, and chickens scratched in the dirt near the door. This family was named Tolliver, a father, mother, and 6 children ranging from toddler to teenager. They were less strange than the Gaines family, more openly friendly, but something about the way they spoke felt practiced, as if they had rehearsed normal conversation without quite mastering its rhythms. That afternoon, the band played lighter material, reels and dance tunes, work songs and humorous ballads. The Tolliver children clapped and stamped, and the parents smiled, and for a few hours, it almost felt like any other performance in any other mountain cabin. But after supper, as the sun dropped behind the western ridges, the father, John Tolliver, pulled Ephraim aside. "Tomorrow you go higher?" "We do. Jacob Riley says there are 3 more families within a day's walk." Tolliver nodded slowly. "The Caudells, the Napiers, the Jessups, they are..." He searched for a word. "Particular. More particular than us, more particular than the Gaines. They have been in these mountains since before white men were supposed to be here. They were here when the Cherokee still held the land. There was an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" "The kind that gets passed down. The kind that gets kept." Tolliver's eyes were serious, almost pleading. "Play your music. Take your pay, but do not stay longer than you must." and do not agree to play anywhere except in the cabins. If they ask you to play in the woods, in the clearings, at the high places, refuse. Why? Because music has power. Your music especially. I heard it today. You play the true versions, the ones with teeth, like Silas said. Music like that can call things, can open doors that ought to stay closed. He gripped Ephraim's shoulder. I say this as a kindness. Go higher if you must, but come back down quickly. That night they slept in the Tolliver barn, bedded down in hay that smelled of summer. Through gaps in the plank walls they could see stars, more stars than any of them had seen before. The Milky Way, a river of light overhead that seemed close enough to touch. I want to go home, James Farrell said quietly. We finish what we started, Ephraim replied. We have commitments. We honor them. But in the darkness, none of them slept easily. September 19th, 1894. 3 miles further up the mountain, the trail crossed a ridgeline where the wind hit them with enough force to make walking difficult. Below, on the northern side, they could see a small valley where a cabin sat beside a creek that was barely more than a trickle. The Caudle place. They descended into the valley as afternoon shadows lengthened. The cabin was built against a rock face, its back wall the natural stone of the mountain itself. A woman stood in the doorway, younger than Mercy Gaines, perhaps 40, with dark hair and darker eyes. She wore a necklace of what looked like bird skulls, small and white, strung on sinew. You are late, she said. We expected you yesterday. The trails were slow, Jacob Riley explained. Come inside. My husband is at the still. He will return soon. The interior was a single room, dim and close. The air thick with smoke from a fire that burned with an odd greenish tint. On a shelf above the fireplace sat jars containing things preserved in cloudy liquid. Roots, shushs, and other objects the musicians tried not to examine too closely. 3 children sat in the corner, playing a game with stones and string. They glanced at the visitors once, then returned to their game as if musicians appearing in their home was entirely unremarkable. You will play tonight, the woman said. But first you will play for my mother. Your mother? She is in the back room. She is old and cannot move easily. You will bring your instruments to her. You will play what she asks. They followed the woman through a low doorway into a space that had been carved directly into the mountain. The walls were bare rock, weeping moisture. The air was cold enough to make their breath visible. In the center of the room, in a chair made of bent saplings and woven strips of bark, sat the oldest human being any of them had ever seen. She could have been 80 or 100 or older still. Her skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that seemed too fragile to support life. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, but she turned her head toward them as they entered, as if she could see perfectly despite the filmed gaze. Come closer, she said in a voice like dry leaves. Let me smell you. They edged forward, instruments in hand. The old woman breathed deeply through her nose, then nodded. You carry the old blood in your music, not in your veins, but in your hands. Your fingers know songs that your minds do not remember. This is good. She gestured with one twisted hand. Play the Elfin Knight. Play it true. Margaret Whitley knew that song, a ballad about a young woman who must complete impossible tasks to win her true love, older than America, older than English, with roots going back to Norse and Celtic traditions. She had learned it from her grandmother, but had never performed it because most audiences found it too strange, too full of riddles and supernatural logic. She glanced at Ephraim, who nodded. They played. The old woman listened with her head tilted back, mouth slightly open, as if tasting the music. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You will play that song again," she said. "You will play it in the high place. The Jessups will ask for it. When they do, you will play it exactly as you did now. No variations, no improvisation. The song must be complete and whole, or it will not work." "What will not work?" Nathaniel asked. The old woman's milky eyes fixed on him. "The binding. The song is a binding. It keeps what should be kept. It closes what should be closed." She settled back in her chair. "You may go now. Play for my daughter and her husband tonight. Tomorrow you go higher. Remember what I said." They backed out of the carved room, unnerved and confused. That night they played for the Caudle family and perhaps a dozen neighbors who appeared from the dark forest and sat in silence, listening. The payment was a leather pouch of gold dust, enough to make the entire trip worthwhile by itself, and a carved wooden token that resembled a very simplified human figure, arms raised, mouth open. "Keep this with you," the Caudle woman said when she pressed it into Thomas Kincaid's hand. "When you need it, you will know." They reached the Napier cabin on September 20th, mid-afternoon. This family was smaller, just a couple, both elderly, living in a cabin so well maintained it looked almost prosperous by mountain standards. The husband was a cooper by trade. Half-finished barrels lined one wall of his workshop, the air rich with the smell of oak shavings and pine tar. "We do not need much music," Samuel Napier said as they unpacked their instruments. "We just want company. It has been a long season with few visitors." It was the most normal reception they had received, and the relief was palpable. That evening, they played lighter material, and the Napiers clapped and hummed along, and afterwards there was cornbread with butter and honey, the first genuinely pleasant meal they had eaten since leaving Fletcher's run. But after supper, while the others slept in the cabin's loft, Samuel Napier pulled Jacob Riley aside for a conversation by the dying fire. "You have been here before, Riley. You know the Jessups." Riley nodded. "Then you know what they do up there, what they keep." Napier's face was grave in the firelight. "I am telling you as a friend. Do not take these people to the Jessup place. Turn back. Go down the mountain. Whatever they are paying you is not worth what will happen." "What will happen?" "I do not know exactly. I have never been there myself. But Samuel Jessup came down here once, maybe 10 years ago. He was looking for musicians. He said his family had been waiting for the right ones. He said they would know them by the way they played the old songs, by whether they played them with teeth." Riley felt cold despite the fire's warmth. "There are stories," Napier continued. "Stories about people who went up there and did not come back. Not all at once, understand. They would leave, they would make it back down to Fletcher's Run or beyond, but then they would start to fade, start to thin out. Within a year, they would be dead, or they would walk back into the mountains and never be seen again." "Stories," Riley said. "Just stories. Maybe. But there is a reason these hills are empty. There is a reason the Cherokee left. There is a reason white settlers avoid this whole valley." Napier leaned forward. "I am not saying the Jessups are evil. I am saying they are old. Old families, old ways, old packs that the rest of us do not understand and should not disturb. We are contracted to play there tomorrow. Then go, but do not stay after dark. Do not accept any payment except coin or food. Do not drink anything they offer you. Do not eat anything prepared by their hands. And for the love of God, Do not let them talk you into playing in the stone circle. The stone circle? Napier stood. You will see it. Half a mile from their cabin, up a deer trail to the north. They will ask you to play there. They will offer you more money than you have ever seen. They will say it is tradition, that it is sacred. Refuse. Play in the cabin if you must, but refuse the circle. Riley wanted to ask more questions, but Napier shook his head and retreated to his sleeping loft, the conversation over. Riley sat by the dying fire, watching the embers pulse, and wondered if he had led 7 good people to their deaths. September 21st dawned cold and clear, the first frost of the season silvering the meadow grass. They left the Napier cabin early, Riley leading them up a trail so faint it was barely distinguishable from game paths. The forest here was old growth, trees so large that 3 men could not have encircled their trunks, their branches creating a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. Around mid-morning, they passed through a grove of dead chestnuts, massive trees that had died on their feet, their bark peeling, their bare branches like skeletal fingers. The American chestnut blight had not yet reached these mountains in 1894, but something had killed these particular trees, killed them years ago from the look of it, and nothing had grown in their place. The ground beneath was bare earth, gray and lifeless. Do not linger here, Riley said, quickening his pace. They passed through without stopping, but Margaret Whitley glanced back once and thought she saw movement among the dead trunks, something pale and thin that ducked behind a tree before she could focus on it. By noon, they reached a stream so clear you could count pebbles 10 feet down. Riley called a halt, and they refilled their canteens. The water was sweet and cold, the best they had tasted since leaving Fletcher's run. The Jessup cabin is perhaps 2 hours further, Riley said. The trail gets rougher. Stay together. Riley, Ephraim said, what did Napier tell you last night? Riley studied his boots. When he spoke, his voice was careful. He warned against certain things, suggested we not stay too long. Be specific. He said not to play in a stone circle near the cabin. He said to refuse payment except in coin or food. He said people who go up there sometimes do not come back right. Then why in hell are we going? James Farrell demanded. Because we are professionals, Thomas Kincaid said, his hand on his ledger like a talisman. We honor our commitments. We play where we are contracted to play. And these are just superstitious mountain people frightening themselves with ghost stories. But his voice lacked conviction. They continued upward. The trail grew steeper, narrower, edging along slopes where a misstep would mean a fatal tumble into ravines choked with rhododendron. They walked single file, silent, saving their breath for the climb. When they finally reached level ground, the sun was low in the west, maybe 2 hours before full dark. Before them, in a small valley cupped between ridges, sat the Jessup cabin. It was larger than the others, a 2-story structure of squared logs with real glass windows, a sign of wealth in these mountains. Smoke rose from the chimney. A barn stood to one side, and beyond it, a structure that looked like a spring house. Everything was neat, well-maintained, almost prosperous. A man stood in the doorway, watching them approach. He was perhaps 50, tall and lean, with gray hair pulled back in a queue like men had worn a century before. He wore dark wool clothing of good quality, and when he raised a hand in greeting, they saw his fingers were long and elegant, the hands of someone who did not do heavy labor. "Welcome," he called, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We have been expecting you. Come inside." You must be weary from the climb." They approached slowly, instruments in hand, feet sore, backs aching from the long ascent. Samuel Jessup smiled as they drew near. His teeth were very white. "You have come a long way to play for us. We appreciate your dedication. Tonight you will rest. Tomorrow we will have music. And then you will be free to go back down the mountain with payment that will make you wealthy men and women." He stepped aside, gesturing them into the cabin's interior. One by one, they crossed the threshold. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. The interior of the Jessup cabin was nothing like what they expected. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding volumes that looked ancient, their spines embossed with gold. A proper wooden floor, not packed earth or rough planks, stretched across the main room. Furniture of quality, chairs with curved backs, a table of dark wood polished to shine, spoke of wealth that had no place in these isolated mountains. A fire burned in a massive stone hearth, carved with symbols similar to those they had seen on the marked trees. Circles, spirals, and geometric patterns that hurt to look at if you focused too long. Samuel Jessup's wife emerged from a back room. A tall woman in her late 40s, dark-haired, with striking features and eyes that seemed black in the lamplight. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that would not have looked out of place in a Louisville parlor. "I am Elsbeth Jessup," she said. "You have met my husband. We have 2 sons who will join us for supper. Please sit. You must be exhausted." They sat, still carrying their instrument cases, reluctant to let them out of their hands. "Your instruments are safe here," Samuel said with amusement. "We understand their value. We are musicians ourselves, after a fashion." That was when they noticed the instruments displayed on the walls. A dulcimer of unusual design, a fiddle with a scroll carved into the shape of something that might have been a human face, a drum made from wood and hide, and decorated with symbols that matched those on the hearth. "You play?" Nathaniel asked. "When the occasion demands," Elsbeth replied, "though we have not had occasion in some time. It is why we asked Jacob Riley to bring you. We heard you performed the old songs in their true forms. Is this accurate?" "We play many songs," Ephraim said carefully. "But you play them with teeth." "Yes?" Samuel leaned forward. "You understand that the songs are not just entertainment. They are structures, forms, containers. You understand this?" The musicians exchanged glances. "We play traditional ballads," Margaret Whitley offered. "Songs passed down through generations." "Yes, passed down because they must be passed down, because they contain things that must be contained, because they bind things that must remain bound." Samuel stood and walked to the fireplace. "You have been playing these songs your entire lives without understanding what you do. You are like a man who carries water without knowing that fire burns. Tonight we will explain. Tomorrow you will play with full knowledge. And the day after, you will leave this place, wealthier and wiser than when you arrived. We appreciate your hospitality," Thomas Kincaid said, attempting to steer toward practical matters. "But we should discuss payment terms and—" "You will be paid in gold," Samuel interrupted. "Enough gold to sustain your band for a year. Enough to purchase new instruments, book better venues, live comfortably. The amount will be weighed out before you leave. Does this satisfy?" It was more than they had made in the previous 5 years combined. "What do you want us to play?" Ephraim asked. "Everything you know. Every old song, every true version. You will play them in sequence, and you will play them without stopping, for as long as you can continue. The music must be sustained. It must not break." Samuel's face was grave now, all traces of hospitality replaced by something harder. This is not a performance. This is a working. Do you understand the difference? No, Nathaniel said honestly. You will. Samuel gestured toward the back rooms. Rest tonight. Eat. Restore your strength. Tomorrow at dusk we begin, and you will learn what your music truly does. The Jessup sons appeared at supper. Young men in their 20s, both dark-haired like their mother, both watching the musicians with an intensity that made eating uncomfortable. The meal was generous. Roasted venison, potatoes, beans, cornbread with butter and honey. Wine in glass goblets, which Kincaid remembered Napier's warning about, and quietly refused. Conversation was minimal. The Jessups asked where they had played before coming here, which families they had visited. They seemed particularly interested in the Caudle place and the old woman in the stone room. What did she tell you? Elsbeth asked. To play the Elfin Knight exactly as we performed it for her, Margaret replied. She said it was a binding, that it keeps what should be kept. The Jessups exchanged glances. And will you? Samuel asked. We will play what we are hired to play. Good. Because tomorrow you will play that song, and many others like it. And if you play them true, if you hold the binding, then come morning you will walk down this mountain with enough gold to change your lives. And if we play them false? Young James Farrell asked, his voice shaking slightly. Samuel Jessup smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Then you will not walk down the mountain at all. They were given rooms on the cabin's second floor, proper bedrooms with real mattresses, a luxury none of them had experienced in weeks. But after the Jessup family had retired, Thomas Kincaid found he could not sleep. The implications of Samuel's final statement gnawed at him, and around midnight he rose, dressed, and crept downstairs. The main room was dark, except for the dying fire. Kincaid stood listening to the cabin's silence, then moved toward the bookshelves. If the Jessups were serious about music as a working, perhaps their library would explain what they meant. He pulled down volumes at random, tilting them toward the firelight to read their spines. Most were in English, but some were in languages he did not recognize. One book, bound in cracked leather, fell open to a page marked with a ribbon. The ballads brought from the old world were never mere entertainment. They are mathematical structures expressing relationships between the world we see and the world we do not. Each song is a wall, each melody a lock, each harmony a seal upon a door that should never open. Kincaid turned pages, finding diagrams that showed songs broken down into component parts, melodies as geometric shapes, harmonies as overlapping circles, lyrics as strings of symbols that resembled both letters and something else entirely. Another passage. The families who keep the high places maintain the songs through generations. When the singers grow old, new singers must be found. The songs must never be allowed to end. If the singing stops, if the bindings break, what has been contained will be released. What has been held at bay will return. A sound behind him. Kincaid spun to find Samuel Jessup standing at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in a nightshirt, holding a candle. You cannot sleep. Not a question. I wanted to understand what you mean by a working. Samuel moved to the fireplace and used his candle to light several lamps. The room brightened, shadows retreating to corners. Sit, Samuel said, gesturing to a chair. I will tell you what your band has been carrying all this time without knowing. Kincaid sat, the book still in his lap. This valley, Samuel began, has been inhabited for a very long time. thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The Cherokee knew about it. The people before the Cherokee knew about it. They knew it was a threshold place, a place where the boundary between this world and others grows thin. Others? Do you believe in God, Mr. Kincaid? I was raised Baptist. Then you believe in heaven and hell, spirits, angels, and demons, the unseen world that exists parallel to our own. Samuel leaned forward. What if I told you that those things are real? Not metaphors, not allegories, but actual places and beings that exist in dimensions we cannot normally perceive. Kincaid said nothing. The old families, the Gaines, the Caudles, the Napiers, the Jessups, and others scattered through these mountains are descendants of people who learned how to interact with those dimensions, how to open doors, briefly, for specific purposes, how to make bargains, how to gain knowledge and power in exchange for service. What kind of service? Keeping the doors closed, because what was opened long ago cannot simply be shut again. It requires constant maintenance, constant reinforcement, and one of the most effective tools for maintaining those boundaries is music. Samuel stood and pulled another book from the shelves, this one bound in dark cloth. He opened it to a page showing a map of the local mountains, marked with X's and dates. Every family in these hills maintains a piece of the binding. The Gaines family maintains the southern gate through their lineage. The Caudles maintain the western through their stillcraft and herb knowledge. The Napiers maintain the eastern through cooperage. They make the vessels that contain. And we, the Jessups, maintain the northern gate through music. The stone circle Napier warned us about. He warned you? Samuel smiled grimly. Good. He knows his role, which is to warn but not to prevent. Yes, the stone circle. It is the focal point, where the boundary is thinnest, where the songs must be sung to maintain the seal. What is sealed? Samuel closed the book. Knowledge that would drive you mad, presences that would end your world, hungers that have waited in darkness since before your species walked upright. His eyes locked on Kincaid's. I am not speaking in metaphors. I am telling you plain fact. Your band was selected because you play the old songs correctly, because you have preserved the bindings without understanding them. Tomorrow night, you will sing those songs in the stone circle, and you will strengthen the seal for another generation. This is why we brought you here. And if we refuse? The seal weakens every day. It has been too long since the last proper working. If you refuse, if you leave, within a month the boundary will fail. What has been held will break through. It will spread from this valley like plague. Within a year, there will be nothing left of the world you know. Kincaid felt ice in his stomach. You are insane. I wish I were. Insanity would be preferable to knowledge. Samuel moved to the window, looking out at darkness. My family has done this for 8 generations. We have recruited singers, brought them here, performed the working. Sometimes they understand. Sometimes they do not. But they always play, because the alternative is unthinkable. What happens to them after? Napier said people who come here don't come back right. A long silence. The working has a cost. The music opens you to what lies beyond. Once you have perceived it, even briefly, you are changed. Most singers make it down the mountain. Most live for a year or two before the visions begin, before they start to thin out, as Napier said. Eventually, they return to the mountains. They walk back up here, and they go through the boundary, and they do not return. You are telling me that playing for you tomorrow will kill us. Not immediately. Not for months, perhaps years. But yes, eventually, the music will consume you. This is the cost of maintaining the boundary. This is the price paid by those who play the binding songs. Samuel turned from the window. But consider the alternative. Your death and 6 others in exchange for the survival of countless thousands. Is that not a worthy trade? Thomas Kincaid stood, his hands shaking. We are leaving. Tonight. Now. You will not make it off the mountain. Samuel's voice was flat, empty of threat or compassion. The trails are too dark, the slopes too steep, and there are things in the forest that will prevent your departure. You came here of your own will. Tomorrow you will play of your own will. And when it is done, you will leave with gold and the knowledge that you have saved your world, even as you have ended yourselves. Kincaid backed toward the stairs, book still clutched in his hands. Wake your companions, Samuel said. Tell them what I have told you. Tomorrow at dusk, we go to the circle. Be ready. They gathered in one of the upstairs rooms, all 7 musicians crowded together, speaking in urgent whispers. Thomas Kincaid had woken them one by one and brought them together. Now, with morning still hours away, he repeated everything Samuel Jessup had told him. He is mad, Margaret Whitley said, or lying, or both. Maybe, Kincaid replied, but what if he is telling the truth? Then we are dead either way, Nathaniel Frost said. Stay and play, die slowly, refuse and let the world end. Not necessarily. Jacob Riley had been silent until now. There is a third option. They turned to him. We play, we take the gold, we leave, and then we warn people. We tell authorities. We bring investigators up here. We expose whatever is happening before it can consume us. Samuel said the working changes you, opens you to perceiving what lies beyond. Once that happens, you cannot undo it. So we are careful. We play the songs, but we do not commit to them fully. We hold something back. We give them enough to satisfy the contract, but not enough to truly open ourselves. Can we do that? Young James asked. Ephraim Frost rubbed his face with both hands. I do not know. When I play fully. That is how the music works. If we hold back, the songs will sound false. They will know. Then what? Sarah Newcomb spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse. She had barely said a word since they arrived at the Jessup cabin. We just let them sacrifice us? We just accept that we walked into a trap? We did not walk into a trap, Kincaid said. We walked into a choice. A terrible choice, but a choice nonetheless. Play and save thousands at the cost of our own lives, or refuse and bear responsibility for whatever follows. If what follows is even real, Margaret insisted, we only have his word. Look around you. Riley gestured at the cabin walls. These are not simple mountain folk. The books downstairs, the quality of the furniture, the way they speak. Samuel Jessup is educated, wealthy, and he has dedicated his life to maintaining something he believes is crucial. Would a man of his apparent intelligence waste decades on superstition? Men have wasted lives on stranger beliefs. True, but a knock at the door silenced them. Elsbeth Jessup's voice carried through the wood. It is nearly dawn. Come downstairs. There is food. We need to prepare. They descended to find a breakfast laid out that was almost grotesquely generous. Eggs, bacon, fresh bread, butter, jam, coffee. The Jessup family sat at the table already eating. Sit, Samuel said. Eat. You will need strength for tonight. They sat. They ate, though the food tasted like ash. When the meal was finished, Samuel produced a leather satchel and poured its contents onto the table. Gold coins, dozens of them, gleaming in the morning light. British sovereigns, Spanish doubloons, American eagles, a fortune in mixed currency. "This is half your payment," Samuel said. "The remainder when the working is complete. Enough to secure your futures, assuming you have futures to secure." "You told me we would die," Kincaid said. "Eventually. Not immediately. You will have time. Perhaps a year, perhaps 5. Enough time to settle debts, make peace, say farewells. More time than many receive." "Generous," Nathaniel said bitterly. "Necessary. The boundary requires sacrifice. It has always required sacrifice. You are not the first to pay this price, and you will not be the last." Ephraim Frost stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "Show us. If this boundary is real, show us. Let us see what we are supposedly holding back." Samuel and Elsbeth exchanged glances. Finally, Samuel nodded. "Come." He led them outside and up a deer trail that climbed the ridge behind the cabin. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, the morning cold and bright, frost crunching under their boots. At the ridge top, the trail opened into a small clearing ringed by standing stones. Not large, barely waist high, but unmistakably placed by human hands in a perfect circle perhaps 30 feet across. In the center of the circle was a hole. Not a cave mouth or a natural depression, but a hole that seemed to absorb light, that made the eyes water to look at directly. The air around it was wrong, too thick, too heavy, tasting of copper and something older. "Approach carefully," Samuel warned. "Do not get too close." They edged forward. As they drew near the circle's center, they began to hear sounds. Not wind, not animals, but something that might have been voices or might have been the grinding of immense mechanisms deep underground. The smell grew stronger, copper and decay and electricity. Margaret Whitley got within 10 feet of the hole and suddenly stumbled backward, her face pale. "I saw—" She could not finish the sentence. Sarah Newcomb put a hand on the nearest standing stone and jerked it back as if burned. "It is cold, colder than ice." "How is it cold?" "The stones are boundaries," Elsbeth said from behind them. "They mark where our world ends and the other begins. The hole is a weak point. Without the songs, it widens. Eventually, it will consume the entire valley, then spread beyond." Ephraim Frost moved closer than any of them had dared, drawn by something he could not name. At the edge of the circle, he stopped and stared into the hole. Later, he would try to describe what he saw, glimpses of landscapes that should not exist, structures that violated geometry, movements that his mind could not process into recognizable shapes, and sounds, a music that was not music, rhythms that made his heartbeat irregular, harmonies that suggested infinite voices singing in infinite dimensions. He staggered back, fell to his knees, vomited into the grass. "You see," Samuel said quietly. "Now you know. The songs you play, the ballads, the old tunes, they create structures that hold this at bay. Your music is not entertainment. It is engineering. And tonight, you will perform the most important concert of your lives, whether it kills you or not." They returned to the cabin in silence, each lost in thoughts too dark to share. The day passed in a haze of dread and preparation. The Jessups seemed almost sympathetic now that the musicians understood their situation. Elsbeth brought them better clothes, clean, warm, well-made garments that would protect against the evening cold at the stone circle. Samuel tuned their instruments himself, adjusting strings and pegs with the practiced touch of someone who understood music at a technical level most players never achieved. "You will play in a specific order," he explained. consulting a book that listed songs in careful sequence. Barbara Allen first, to establish the foundation. Then the Twa Sisters, Lord Randall, the Demon Lover. Each song builds upon the previous. Each harmony reinforces the binding. "How long must we play?" Ephraim asked. "Until the moon reaches its zenith. Perhaps 3 hours, perhaps 4. You will know when the working is complete. You will feel it." That afternoon, Kincaid found himself alone with Jacob Riley on the cabin's front porch. The view stretched for miles, ridges and valleys fading into blue distance, the Appalachian chain rolling away toward horizons they would never see. "You led us here," Kincaid said. "You knew what this was." Riley said nothing for a long time. Finally, "I suspected. I did not know for certain. I had been here once before, yes, but they did not tell me the full truth. They said only that they needed musicians for a special occasion. I thought it was some kind of harvest festival, mountain custom. And now? Now I think we are damned either way. Play and die. Do not play and let the world die. There is no good choice. We could still leave, run down the mountain, take our chances. You saw the hole, you felt it. Do you truly believe running will save you? Whatever is there, it knows you now. You looked into it. It looked into you. There is no escaping that knowledge." Kincaid closed his eyes. "Then we play. We play." As dusk approached, the Jessup family emerged from the cabin dressed in ceremonial garments, long robes of dark wool embroidered with those familiar symbols, spirals, circles, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when not observed directly. The 2 sons carried torches. Elsbeth carried a basket containing bread and salt. Samuel carried the leather satchel containing the musician's payment. "It is time," Samuel said. The 7 musicians gathered their instruments, fiddles, banjo, guitar, mandolin, bass, and followed the Jessup family up the trail toward the stone circle. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of red and orange that looked like distant fire. The air grew colder with each step. When they reached the circle, the hole at its center was darker than before, deeper, pulsing with a rhythm that matched their heartbeats. The standing stones seemed taller somehow, their surfaces crawling with shadows that had no source. "Stand here," Samuel directed, positioning the musicians around the circle's edge, their backs to the stones, facing inward toward the hole. "Do not stop playing once you begin. Do not look directly into the center for too long. Let the music flow through you, not from you. You are channels, not sources." The musicians took their positions. They adjusted their instruments, fingers finding familiar grips on necks and bows. Despite everything, the fear, the knowledge, the certainty of their doom, they felt a strange calm settling over them. This was what they did. This was their purpose. Ephraim Frost raised his bow. "Ready?" The others nodded. "Then let us play." The first notes of Barbara Allen rose into the gathering darkness, and something shifted. The air became thicker, more resistant, as if they were playing underwater. The sound did not disperse normally, but spiraled inward toward the hole, which seemed to pulse in response. Margaret Whitley's voice joined the instruments, her soprano clear and strong despite her fear. The old ballad unfolded, the story of a young woman who scorns her lover, only to die of grief when he perishes from heartbreak. A simple tale of cruelty and consequence. But here, in this place, the words seemed to carry weight beyond their meaning. In Scarlet Town, where I was born, there was a fair maid dwelling, made every youth cry well-a-day. Her name was Barbara Allen. As they played, the whole responded. The shadows within it grew darker, more solid, taking on shapes that might have been reaching hands, or might have been something else entirely. The musicians felt a pull, as if the whole wanted to draw them inward, wanted to consume them and their music together. But the song held. The melody created a structure, invisible but real, that the whole could not breach. When they finished Barbara Allen, there was a moment of terrible silence. Then Samuel Jessup called out the next song. The Twa Sisters. Do Not Stop. They launched immediately into the darker ballad, the tale of a sister drowned by her sibling out of jealousy, her bones made into a harp that sings out the murder. Nathaniel's banjo drove the rhythm forward, while Ephraim's fiddle wove the haunting melody. The words spoke of death and betrayal, transformation and revenge. There lived two sisters in a bower, Benori, oh. Benori Hans. There lived two sisters in a bower, by the bonny mill, dams of Benori. The whole writhed. That was the only word for it. The darkness at the circle's center twisted and convulsed, like a living thing in pain. Sounds emerged from it. Not words, but something that might have been screaming or laughter, or both at once. Young James Farrell's hands began to bleed. The mandolin strings cut into his fingers, but he could not stop, dared not stop. The music had taken control. They were no longer playing but being played, instruments themselves in some larger performance. Sarah Newcomb felt tears streaming down her face, though she had no memory of beginning to cry. The songs were pulling memories from her. Dead children, lost husband, all the grief she had pushed down in order to continue living. The music gave it form, gave it purpose, channeled it into the binding. They played Lord Randall next, then The Demon Lover, then Tam Lin. Each song built upon the previous, creating layers of meaning and structure that wove together into something architectural. They were building a wall of music, a barrier of harmony, a seal constructed from melody and memory and loss. The moon rose, huge and silver, climbing toward its zenith. The stone circle seemed to glow in its light, the symbols carved into the standing stones becoming briefly visible, ancient markings that predated any known language. "The Elfin Knight!" Samuel shouted over the music. "Now!" Margaret Whitley stepped forward, her voice rising above the instruments. "Si plaid awa, my plaid awa, and o'er the hills and far awa to Norawa, my plaid shall not be blown away." The old woman at the caudle place had been right. This song was a binding, complex, and specific, full of impossible tasks and supernatural requirements. As they played it, the whole began to close. Not physically, but perceptually, becoming less real, less present, fading from a wound in reality to something more like a scar. They played for 4 hours by the moon's movement, song after song, the old ballads pouring out in sequence. Their fingers bled. Their voices grew hoarse. Thomas Kincaid's bass playing had worn grooves into his palms, but they could not stop, would not stop, because the music had become larger than themselves. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, Ephraim Frost felt something shift inside him, a door opening in his mind, or perhaps a wall dissolving. He began to perceive things he had never seen before, the landscape layered with other landscapes, the mountains containing different mountains, the sky showing different skies. He saw the other musicians glowing with their own light, their music visible as threads of gold and silver spiraling toward the whole, weaving together into a net that held back darkness. And he saw things in that darkness, beings, presences, intelligences vast and cold and utterly inhuman, pressing against the boundary, testing it, searching for weakness. The songs were keeping them at bay, but barely. The barrier was thin here, worn through by time and neglect. But the music was repairing it. Each song added another layer, another thread to the net, another bar to the cage. The working was succeeding. Finally, as the moon reached its peak, Samuel Jessup raised his hand. The final song, The Unquiet Grave. Make it true. They played the darkest ballad of all, the story of a lover who visits his dead beloved's grave so often, weeping so copiously that he prevents her spirit from resting. A song about grief that will not end, about love that becomes torment, about the necessity of letting go. The wind doth blow today, my love, and a few small drops of rain. I never had but one true love. In cold grave she was lain as they played, the hole closed. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. The darkness receded. The pressing presence withdrew. The working was complete. The musicians lowered their instruments, swaying with exhaustion. In the moonlight, they could see blood on their hands, tears on their faces, their clothes soaked with sweat despite the cold. Samuel Jessup approached, carrying the leather satchel. He poured the remaining gold onto a flat stone, twice as much as they had seen that morning. The working is complete. The boundary is restored. You have done what was required. His face was grave. Take the gold. Leave tomorrow at first light. Go down the mountain and live what remains of your lives as best you can. How long do we have? Ephraim asked, his voice barely a whisper. The change has already begun. You felt it during the working. The door opening, the perception widening. Within days, you will begin to see things others cannot. Within months, the visions will intensify. Within a year, Samuel did not finish. Within a year, we will come back here. Yes, the music will call you. The boundary will draw you. You will return, and you will cross over, and you will join whatever waits beyond. This is the price. This has always been the price. The musicians gathered their instruments and their gold in silence. They had saved the world. They had doomed themselves. Both truths could not be reconciled, could not be processed, could only be endured. They descended the trail to the cabin and slept fitfully until dawn. September 23rd, 1894. The Fletcher's Run string band left the Jessup cabin at first light, their instrument cases heavy in their hands, their pockets weighted with gold. The Jessup family stood in the doorway, watching them go, their faces impossible to read. The descent was faster than the climb had been. They moved down the mountain in silence, each lost in private horror. Already Ephraim Frost was seeing things at the edge of his vision, shadows that moved wrong, trees that seemed to breathe, the landscape layered with phantom versions of itself. They reached the Napier cabin by mid-morning. Samuel Napier took one look at their faces and knew. You played in the circle. We did. Then you are lost. I am sorry. I tried to warn you. They did not stop at the Caudle place or the Tolliver cabin or the Gaines homestead. They walked straight through, pushing themselves, desperate to reach Fletcher's Run and some semblance of normalcy, even though they knew normality was gone forever. They arrived in Fletcher's Run on September 25th, gaunt and hollow-eyed, looking like they had been gone months instead of 10 days. Reverend Amos Fletcher met them at the schoolhouse. You have returned, he said, studying them, but not as you left. No, Ephraim replied, not as we left. The Jessups took what they wanted? They took what they needed. Fletcher nodded slowly. I am sorry. I sent you up there knowing what would happen. The Jessups pay me in silver to direct musicians their way when I find ones who can play the old songs true. This is my sin. I bear it. You could have warned us. I could have. But if you had known, you would not have gone. And if you had not gone, the working would not have been completed. Sometimes we must sacrifice the few to save the many. Sometimes we must bear the guilt of that sacrifice. Fletcher's watery eyes brimmed. I am damned for what I have done. But the world continues. Take comfort in that if you can. They stayed in Fletcher's Run only one night, then continued down out of the mountains toward Hazard, toward Letcher County, toward the world they had known before. But the world was already changing. Margaret Whitley began to hear music that no one else heard, songs in ancient languages, harmonies that made her weep for reasons she could not name. James Farrell saw faces in the trees, watching him as he walked. Thomas Kincaid's ledger filled with strange entries he had no memory of writing, descriptions of places he had never visited. They played one final performance together in Hazard on October 3, 1894. The audience reported later that the band had never sounded better, that the music had seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, that they had felt things during the performance they could not explain. Sorrow and joy and terror mixed together until they became indistinguishable. After that performance, the band dissolved. They could no longer bear to be together, to be reminded of what they had done and what awaited them. They split the gold and went their separate ways. Margaret Whitley returned to her family farm and died 3 months later. The doctor called it a wasting sickness, but her sister reported that in her final days, Margaret had spoken constantly of music she needed to reach, of voices calling her back to the mountains. Thomas Kincaid made it to January before the visions became unbearable. He walked into the winter woods north of Hazard and never returned. Search parties found his ledger torn to pieces and scattered in a clearing, but no sign of the man himself. Young James Farrell tried to fight what was happening to him. He moved to Louisville, found work in a factory, attempted to build a new life far from the mountains. But on March 1st, 1895, his landlady found his room empty, his mandolin left behind on the bed, a note beside it reading only, "The music requires me. I must go back." Sarah Newcomb, who had already lost so much, seemed almost relieved when the calling began. She told a friend she was going home, though she had no home to return to. She walked back into the mountains in April of 1895 and was never seen alive again. Nathaniel Frost lasted until June. His brother Ephraim watched him fade day by day, growing more translucent somehow, more distant, until one morning he simply wasn't there anymore. His room was empty. His banjo sat in the corner untouched. He had returned to the boundary. Jacob Riley disappeared in August without warning or goodbye. Of all of them, he seemed to understand best what was happening. He left a letter for Ephraim. The music opened doors that cannot be closed. We perceived what should not be perceived. Now we belong to that other place more than we belong to this one. The only question was how long we could resist the calling. I can no longer resist. Tell no one what we did. The world is saved. That must be enough. Ephraim Frost held on longer than the others, perhaps because he was the strongest, or perhaps because he was the most stubborn, or perhaps because he wanted to bear witness, to ensure someone remembered what they had done and why. He returned to Fletcher's Run in October of 1895, 1 year and 1 month after they had first climbed into the high country. Reverend Fletcher was dead, had died in his sleep in March, people said, though some whispered he had taken his own life, unable to bear the guilt of sending musicians to the Jessup place. Ephraim spent his final days writing everything down, where they had gone, what they had played, what they had seen. He filled a notebook with details he knew would sound like madness to anyone who had not experienced the working. But he wrote it anyway because truth deserved recording, even truth that no one would believe. On November 3rd, 1895, exactly 1 year after the trapper, Silas Caldwell, found the 5 fiddles arranged in a circle near Slaughter Creek, Ephraim walked back up the mountain trail. His notebook he left with the Fletcher's Run schoolteacher, a young woman named Martha Collins, who had admired his playing. "Keep this safe," he told her. "One day someone will want to know what happened to us. One day this might matter." He climbed alone, carrying only his fiddle. The trail was familiar now, marked by memory more than physical signposts. As he climbed, he felt the music building inside him, not the songs he had played in the stone circle, but something older, something that had been waiting his entire life to be released. Near dusk, he reached the circle. The hole was there, smaller than before, but still present, still pulsing with that familiar rhythm. The Jessup family stood waiting. "You resisted longer than most," Samuel said, "but the music is stronger than resistance." "I know." Ephraim's voice was calm. "I have known since that night. This is the price, and I have always been willing to pay it." "Do you regret what you did?" Ephraim thought about that. About the world continuing below in the valleys, people living and loving and dying without ever knowing how close they had come to ending. About the music he had made and the lives it had saved. "No," he said finally. "No regrets." He raised his fiddle and began to play one final song. Not one of the old ballads, not one of the binding songs, but something new, something he had composed in his final days, a melody that expressed everything he had learned about music and sacrifice and the price of keeping the darkness at bay. As he played, he walked toward the circle's center, toward the hole, toward the boundary between worlds. The music spiraled around him, golden threads visible only to eyes that had been opened by the working. He played his way across the threshold, fiddle singing, and stepped into the darkness beyond. For a moment, the Jessups saw him silhouetted against something vast and terrible and beautiful, still playing. Then he was gone. The fiddle fell silent. The hole closed slightly, strengthened by his passage, his music woven forever into the boundary's fabric. Samuel Jessup bent and picked up the fallen fiddle. He carried it back to the cabin and hung it on the wall beside the others, instruments left behind by previous musicians, previous workings, previous sacrifices stretching back generations. "The boundary holds," he said to his wife, "for now." 3 months later, in February of 1896, Silas Caldwell returned to the site where he had found the 5 fiddles. Local rumors had drawn him back, stories of music heard drifting through the hollows, of shadowy figures seen walking trails that led nowhere. He found the clearing empty except for a single instrument lying in the exact center, a fiddle with strings still rosined, its wood showing no weather damage despite months of mountain winter. He did not touch it. He marked the location in his mind and returned to Fletcher's Run, where he told Martha Collins what he had seen. She gave him Ephraim Frost's notebook, which he read through in a single sitting, his hands shaking. The notebook disappeared into a private collection shortly after. But photocopies circulated among collectors of Appalachian folklore, and the story of the Fletcher's Run string band became a legend, half remembered, its details corrupted by repetition and time. Even now, hikers in the Cumberland Mountains report hearing music that has no source. Old ballads sung in harmony by voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rangers dismiss these reports as wind through the trees, acoustic tricks caused by the terrain. But the old families who still live in the high hollows know better. They hear the music, and they understand that it is the boundary holding, the working continuing, the sacrifice ongoing. 7 musicians went into those mountains in September of 1894. They saved a world that never knew it needed saving. And somewhere, in the spaces between notes, in the silence between songs, they are playing still. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.